Right now, tens of thousands of Australians are quietly looking up flights, visas, and rental listings in countries most of them have never lived in before. Not for a holiday, not for adventure, because the numbers at home no longer work. The full single-age pension pays Pinahen $1,200.90 fortnight. The median home in this country now costs over $900,000. And for a growing number of older Australians, the math simply stopped adding up somewhere along the way. So the map opens: Bali, Thailand, Vietnam, Portugal, cheaper, warmer, slower, but most who make that move have no idea what waits for them after the bags are unpacked. The real story isn't why Australians are choosing to retire abroad. It's what unfolds in the years after they arrive. It begins with a promise this country quietly stopped keeping. For most of the 20th century, the Australian retirement story followed a familiar shape: work steadily, pay off a home, build superannuation, and arrive at retirement with security already in place. That expectation shaped entire generations of decisions: where to live, when to have children, how much to save. But the arithmetic behind that promise has shifted in ways many people didn't see coming until they were standing inside it. The full age pension for a single person now sits at $1,200.90 fortnight, just over $31,000 a year. A couple, combined, receives around $47,000. The Association of Superannuation Funds of Australia estimates that a genuinely comfortable retirement costs a single person more than $53,000 a year and a couple more than $75,000. For anyone relying mainly on the pension, that gap is not small. It's the difference between covering the basics and actually living, and the basics themselves have changed. The national median dwelling value passed $922,000 in early 2026. In Sydney, the median home now costs more than 13 times the median household income, placing it among the least affordable cities on Earth, behind only Hong Kong. Households across the country are now spending a record share of their income, over a third, just on rent. The average Australian needs roughly 11 years to save a deposit on a median-priced home. 3 years ago, around 4 in 10 median-income households could afford to buy that home. Today, it's fewer than 1 in 7. For people who spent their working lives believing a paid-off home was the reward at the end, that reward has moved further away with almost every year that's passed. Interest rate rises have added another layer. By March 2026, the Reserve Bank's cash rate had climbed again, the result of consecutive increases, pushing mortgage repayments higher for anyone still carrying debt into retirement. Energy bills, council rates, private health insurance premiums, and grocery costs have all climbed in the same period. None of these expenses are optional, and none of them are shrinking. For many retirees, the space between income and outgoings has simply disappeared. Longer lifespans have changed the equation further. Retirement today can stretch across 2, sometimes 3 decades. The old idea of a quiet, worry-free finish line has been replaced by something closer to constant recalculation, reviewing bills, comparing providers, deciding what can be delayed another month. The toll of this is rarely loud. It shows up in small private adjustments: skipping a regular dental check, driving the same car 5 years longer than planned, turning the heater on later in the evening, quietly shelving a grandchild's birthday trip that used to be automatic. It's this slow erosion, not any single crisis, that turns retiring abroad from a fantasy into a practical calculation. And once people start running the numbers seriously, a handful of destinations come up again and again. Southeast Asia tops the list for one simple reason: distance from the pension dollar stretches further there than almost anywhere else. In parts of Bali, a comfortable 1 or 2 bedroom rental can be found for $300 to $700 a month. A retiree living in Da Nang, Vietnam has reported covering rent, transport, food and entertainment for around $1,100 a month total, with rent itself making up less than half of that. In the Philippines and Malaysia, similar patterns repeat: lower rent, lower grocery bills, and an established Australian and broader expat community already in place in cities like Chiang Mai, Hua Hin, Phuket, and Cebu. Southern Europe draws a different kind of retiree, one chasing culture and climate as much as affordability. Portugal and Spain remain popular for their slower pace, mild winters, and large existing expat networks, while Italy and Greece appeal to those with family heritage or a longing for a more European rhythm of life. New Zealand offers something else again: geographic closeness, a shared language, and for many, a sense that the move barely counts as leaving home at all. A retiree from Adelaide, as one representative example of this pattern, sold a modest three-bedroom house for around $700,000, paid cash for a villa near the Balinese coast for under $200,000, and now lives on a fraction of what the same lifestyle would cost back home. On paper, it looks like a clean win. In practice, the story rarely ends at the property settlement. Superannuation adds its own layer of complexity to that settlement. For Australian citizens and permanent residents, superannuation generally remains accessible from overseas once the normal conditions of release are met, and pensions or lump sums drawn after age 60 are typically tax-free under Australian law. But that tax treatment doesn't automatically carry across borders. Some destination countries treat foreign pension income as taxable, meaning a retiree can find part of what was a tax-free Australian payment suddenly subject to local income tax once it lands in a foreign bank account. Self-managed super funds face an even tighter constraint, since the trustees and central management of an SMSF generally need to remain based in Australia, a requirement that can be jeopardized if a retiree who also acts as trustee relocates permanently without proper planning. None of this is insurmountable, but it's the kind of detail that rarely appears in the retirement brochures, and the kind of mistake that's expensive to unwind after the fact. The first complication most people don't research properly is the pension itself. The age pension is portable, but only within strict limits. For the first 6 weeks overseas, nothing changes. After 6 weeks, supplements begin reducing and the energy supplement disappears entirely. After 26 weeks, Centrelink recalculates the payment based on something called Australian Working Life Residence, the number of years you are considered an Australian resident between age 16 and pension age, out of a required 35 years for the full rate. Someone with 25 years of working life residence living permanently in Bali receives roughly 25/35 of the full pension, a meaningful and permanent reduction on what they were getting at home. And if the pension was only recently granted, a 2-year waiting period applies before it becomes portable at all. Leave too early, even for 3 days to attend a funeral, and payments can stop. Australia holds social security agreements with around 30 countries, including New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and much of Europe, which can soften some of these rules. Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Bali are not among them. For retirees heading to Southeast Asia specifically, the country where the pension dollar goes furthest is often the same country where the pension itself shrinks the fastest under Centrelink's rules. Healthcare is the second hurdle, and it tends to surface only once it's needed. Medicare does not travel. Australia has reciprocal healthcare agreements with a short list of countries, including New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Italy, Malta, the Netherlands, Belgium, and several Nordic nations, allowing limited access to public care while there. Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines are not on that list. For retirees in those countries, healthcare means private insurance, paid out of pocket every time. In Indonesia, adequate private cover has reportedly cost expats around $800 a year for routine needs. Manageable while healthy, but the real exposure comes later, when chronic conditions or major procedures enter the picture and that insurance either won't cover it or wasn't renewed at a high enough level. A fall, a cardiac event, or a cancer diagnosis can turn an affordable lifestyle into an urgent and expensive evacuation back to Australian care, often at a point when health itself makes that journey harder to manage. Then there's the part almost no one researches before they leave: what happens to the relationships left behind? The World Health Organization has formally recognized loneliness as a public health concern, with documented links to higher blood pressure, cognitive decline, and shortened life expectancy. Several studies into retirees who relocate internationally late in life have found higher reported rates of isolation compared with those who remain near family and established communities. Grandchildren's milestones arrive through a phone screen instead of a lounge room. A daughter's visit becomes an annual event instead of a weekly one. Video calls help, but they don't replace a neighbor who notices when something's wrong, or family at the kitchen table on a difficult day. For many, the hardest part of life abroad isn't the cost or even the paperwork. It's the slow realization that belonging doesn't relocate as easily as furniture does. A different but equally representative case illustrates how this can unravel. A retired couple from regional Queensland sold their home and moved to a coastal town in Vietnam, drawn by the same calculation as everyone else: a stretched pension, a tightening housing market, and the promise of a slower, cheaper life. The first 18 months matched the brochure almost exactly: low rent, warm weather, an active expat social calendar. Then one partner was diagnosed with a condition requiring ongoing specialist treatment. Local private insurance covered only part of the cost. The nearest specialist equipped to manage the condition was several hours away, and language barriers turned routine appointments into long, exhausting ordeals. After 2 years, they made the decision to return to Australia, re-entering a rental market they had exited at far lower prices, and discovering that the modest nest egg set aside for emergencies had been substantially eroded by medical costs and the expense of an unplanned move home. Their experience isn't presented here as the inevitable outcome, but as a realistic illustration of how quickly the equation can shift once health enters the picture. Visa and residency rules add another layer of friction that tends to shift without much warning. Several popular Southeast Asian retirement visa programs have tightened income and asset requirements in recent years, raising the financial bar for entry just as currency movements have made meeting that bar harder for some. Malaysia's long-running retiree visa program, once one of the more accessible options in the region, has progressively raised its required liquid assets and monthly income thresholds, slowing approvals even for applicants already partway through the process. Other Southeast Asian destinations have introduced similar tightening, adding minimum deposit requirements held in local banks or requiring proof of ongoing income that excludes some pensioners relying solely on the age pension. The Australian dollar's value against other major currencies has also fluctuated significantly over recent years, and for a retiree on a fixed pension converted into local currency each month, that volatility alone can mean the difference between a comfortable month and a tight one, through no fault of their own budgeting. A run of months where the dollar weakens against the local currency can quietly erase what looked like a generous cost of living buffer on the spreadsheet drawn up before the move. Banking adds friction too. Some Australian financial institutions have tightened screening on transfers linked to overseas residents in recent years, citing anti-money laundering obligations, occasionally freezing or delaying pension payments mid-transfer while compliance checks run their course, leaving retirees waiting on funds they were counting on for rent due that week. Retirees who relied on a single Australian bank account for decades sometimes find themselves needing two accounts, two sets of paperwork, and two countries' worth of reporting obligations just to keep money moving reliably each month. Legal paperwork rarely gets easier with distance either. A will drafted under Australian law isn't automatically recognised overseas, and in several popular destinations, a separate local will covering locally held assets is strongly recommended to avoid lengthy probate delays. Property ownership rules, inheritance law, and succession processes differ from country to country, and in some jurisdictions, forced inheritance laws can override what a person actually intended for their estate, directing assets to family members in proportions the retiree never chose. Foreign ownership restrictions add another wrinkle in several Southeast Asian countries, where non-citizens often cannot own land outright, and instead lease it or hold property through structures that carry their own legal risks if not set up correctly from the outset. Retirees who skip the step of consulting a local solicitor before signing a lease or buying property often discover the gap only when a dispute arises, usually at the worst possible time, when health, finances, or family circumstances have already made the situation harder to manage. What separates the retirees who genuinely thrive abroad from those who quietly return within a few years tends to come down to a small number of factors, not luck. Good health going in matters enormously, since navigating an unfamiliar healthcare system, language, and bureaucracy is far harder when already managing illness. A liquid savings buffer separate from the pension gives room to absorb currency swings, medical surprises, or a sudden need to fly home. Realistic budgeting beats hopeful budgeting every time, accounting for the bad months as much as the good ones. Family connection, whether through regular visits home or relatives willing to travel, softens the isolation that catches so many people off guard. And a genuine willingness to learn the local language and build new social ties tends to matter more than any spreadsheet. The retirees who skip these steps and lean purely on the cost of living comparison are disproportionately represented among those who return to Australia within 5 years, usually after a health scare, a financial shock, or a level of loneliness they didn't expect to feel. Coming home after that point is rarely simple either. Re-entering the property market after selling a home years earlier at today's prices can mean permanently downsizing expectations or renting indefinitely in a market with vacancy rates sitting near historic lows. The decision to leave doesn't only affect the person who goes. When an older Australian sells a family home to fund a move abroad, That property re-enters a market already short by hundreds of thousands of dwellings nationally, sometimes easing pressure for a young family trying to buy in, sometimes simply changing hands among investors. The spending power that retiree once contributed to a local high street, a regional town, a suburban shopping strip, shifts instead to markets and economies overseas. Communities lose long-term residents who once volunteered, mentored, and anchored local life. Aged care providers, GP clinics, and community organizations built around servicing an aging local population can also feel the effect when enough of that population relocates, particularly in regional towns where retirees have historically made up a disproportionate share of volunteers and informal carers for one another. None of this makes the decision wrong. It simply means the ripple extends further than most people consider when they're staring at a one-way flight comparison and a villa listing. None of this means retiring abroad is a mistake. For people who go in with a liquid financial buffer, good health, realistic expectations, and a plan for staying connected to family, it can genuinely deliver the security and dignity that feels increasingly out of reach in Australia's current cost of living. For others, the version of the dream sold in glossy expat blogs and real estate listings collides with portability rules, healthcare gaps, currency swings, and a kind of loneliness no spreadsheet accounts for. The pension system was built around the assumption that most recipients would stay close to the country that built it. The housing market has made staying close increasingly expensive, and so more Australians than ever are weighing a question their parents' generation rarely had to ask seriously: whether security in retirement means staying near everything familiar, or whether it means leaving to find a version of comfort that home can no longer reliably provide. The real question isn't whether Australians can make a life on the other side of that decision. Many will, and many already have. The question is what kind of country we're describing when an entire generation's retirement plan increasingly starts with a one-way ticket out of it.